March 11th, 1945. Philippine Sea, 80 miles east of Okinawa. Lieutenant Kazuo Kasuga grips the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M-0 as the engine sputters violently. His aircraft, loaded with a 550-pound bomb, shudders against the turbulent air. Below, the massive American aircraft carrier USS Intrepid cuts through the waves, surrounded by a protective screen of destroyers. Kasuga's forehead glistens with sweat beneath his senenbari, the 1,000-stitch belt given to him by his mother for protection. The irony is crushing. He was never meant to return from this mission, yet now, with mechanical failure threatening his aircraft, survival suddenly seems more terrifying than the death he had prepared for. Lieutenant Kasuga was one of the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack units better known to Americans as Kamikaze, or Divine Wind. By early 1945, Imperial Japan had transformed desperation into doctrine. Over 3,800 kamikaze pilots would die in the war's final months, with their suicide attacks sinking or damaging more than 400 Allied vessels. But history has largely forgotten those who failed to complete their final missions, the men who survived their own suicides. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the Kamikaze program, had established the first special attack unit on October 19, 1944, at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines. "Japan is in grave danger," he told the assembled pilots that day. "The salvation of our country is now beyond the powers of the ministers of state, the general staff, and lowly commanders like myself. It can come only from spirited young men such as you." The psychological conditioning was absolute. At the Tsuchiura Naval Air Base near Tokyo, Commander Tadasu Kotani trained pilots specifically for these missions. The average age of these airmen was just 23. Many were university students, hastily trained as Japan's veteran pilots had been decimated in earlier campaigns. They were taught that their deaths would be meaningful, that through self-sacrifice they would protect their homeland and earn a place among Japan's revered spirits at Yasukuni Shrine. But for every 5 kamikaze pilots who took off on their final missions, one returned. Engine failures, weather conditions, navigational errors, mechanical malfunctions. The reasons varied, but the psychological impact remained constant, crushing. These men had already psychologically died. They had written their final letters, drunk their ceremonial susk, and given away their possessions. Their families had often already been notified of their heroic deaths. Ensign Kenichiro Unuki would later recall, "We were already dead men. To return alive was to return in shame." After his engine failed during a mission targeting Allied ships off Okinawa in April 1945, he was recovered from the sea by a Japanese patrol boat. When he returned to base, his belongings had already been distributed among his squadron mates. His name had been struck from the roster. In the mess hall, he sat alone, a ghost among the living. As Lieutenant Kasuga Zero continues to lose altitude, he faces the impossible choice that confronted dozens of kamikaze pilots in similar circumstances. Attempt to limp back to base and face the shame of survival, or crash into the sea in a final, futile gesture that would fulfill neither his mission nor his sacrifice. October 25th, 1944. The Philippines Sea. Lieutenant Takeo Tagata feels the weight of the rising sun, headband tightening across his forehead as he climbs into his Mitsubishi A6M-0. The ceremonial sack still burns in his throat. His squadron mates bow deeply as he taxis toward the runway of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku. They will never see him again. That is the plan. That is the oath. That is the honor. Yet, within 24 hours, Lieutenant Tagata will commit what the Imperial Japanese Navy considers the ultimate betrayal. He will still be alive. The psychological burden carried by the estimated 1,036 kamikaze pilots who survived their missions represented one of the war's most profound moral paradoxes. For these men, survival itself became a form of disgrace. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, had been explicit when he first proposed the special attack units on October 19, 1944. Standing before a group of young pilots at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, he delivered the words that would condemn thousands. Japan is in grave danger. The salvation of our country is now beyond the powers of the ministers of state, the general staff, and lowly commanders like myself. There's only one way left to save our country, and that is for you to sacrifice your lives. The mathematics of death was brutally simple. Japan's conventional air attacks against Allied vessels typically resulted in a 5% success rate. Kamikaze attacks raised this to nearly 28%. Each suicide pilot who returned represented a statistical failure in a desperate strategy. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, staff officer to Admiral Onishi, documented in his post-war memoir that pilots who survived were subject to a special kind of shame that transcended ordinary military failure. Those who returned faced not only the disgrace of having failed their mission, but also the psychological torment of having broken a sacred oath. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Shindo survived when his Zero developed engine trouble during a kamikaze mission over Okinawa in April 1945. His personal diary, recovered after the war, reveals the depth of his anguish. I live as a ghost now. My death was promised to the Emperor. Each breath I take feels stolen. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintains strict protocols for these unexpected survivors. According to recovered military documents, pilots who returned were typically reassigned to another suicide mission within 48 hours. Records from the 721st Air Group show that 11 pilots survived their first kamikaze mission. All were immediately reassigned. 8 died on their second attempt. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, considered the first official kamikaze pilot, reportedly told a correspondent before his fatal mission, "Japan's future is bleak if it must rely on such desperate measures." His words proved prophetic not only for Japan's military prospects, but for the psychological wasteland that awaited those who survived. The burden of survival created a unique form of trauma. Medical records from Naval Hospital Tokyo documented cases of pilots who returned with physical injuries only to attempt ritual suicide while recovering. 3 documented cases exist of pilots who, having survived their missions due to mechanical failures, later took their own lives in their barracks. For these men, the Tokatai special attack oath had transformed survival from humanity's most basic instinct into an unforgivable disgrace. They had been celebrated as heroes, given death poems, and ceremonially removed from family registries. They were, in the most profound sense, already dead, yet somehow still breathing. July 1946. Tokyo, Japan. Former Lieutenant Kazuo Senyo carefully burns his military photographs in a metal trash can behind his modest home. The acrid smoke rises as images of his Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber dissolve into ash. His hands tremble slightly, not from the act of destruction, but from the memories of what almost was. Senyo was among the 3,800 kamikaze pilots who survived the war, despite being assigned to special attack units. For him and hundreds like him, The war's end didn't bring liberation. It brought shame and a desperate need to hide their past. We were the walking dead who somehow kept breathing, Seino later confided in a rare 1970s interview with historian Rikihei Inoguchi. In a culture that glorified the beautiful death, we bore the ugly burden of continued life. By autumn 1945, an estimated 1,236 kamikaze pilots had survived their supposed final missions. They returned for various reasons: mechanical failures, weather conditions, inability to locate targets, or last-minute cancellations as Japan surrendered. Unlike their 3,860 comrades who perished in fiery crashes against Allied vessels, these men faced a different kind of death: social extinction. Former Ensign Takehiko Ena, who survived 3 separate kamikaze missions due to aircraft malfunctions, disappeared into rural Shizuoka Prefecture. He worked as a schoolteacher under his mother's maiden name until 1965. "I told no one," he recounted in his 1989 memoir. "Not my wife, not my children. The shame was too great. We were supposed to die. Our training, our ceremonies, our farewell parties, everything prepared us for death, not for life." The psychological burden was immense. According to military psychologist Dr. Shigeru Nakajima's 1975 study of 134 surviving kamikaze pilots, 89% reported persistent nightmares, 76% admitted to suicidal thoughts after the war, and 42% developed alcohol dependencies. They existed in a psychological limbo. Nakajima wrote, having psychologically died already, they struggled to construct new identities. Many, like Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Minobe, who survived when his mission was aborted midway due to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, adopted elaborate cover stories. Minobe claimed to have served in an administrative position far from the combat. He moved to Hokkaido, changed his name, and worked as a fisherman for 27 years, before a chance encounter with a former squadron mate forced him to confront his past. The hardest part wasn't flying toward death, Minobe told the Asahi Shimbun in a rare 1983 interview. It was living with the knowledge that we had been expendable, and worse, that we had accepted it, embraced it even. How do you explain that to your children? The government offered no support for these men. Official records of kamikaze units were deliberately destroyed during the surrender. The U.S. occupation authorities, concerned about nationalist resurgence, prohibited public discussion of the special attack units. These men became ghosts in their own country, alive when they should have been dead, hidden when they should have been honored. October 25th, 1944. Leyte Gulf. Lieutenant Yukio Seki stands on the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku, his eyes fixed on the horizon where American ships gather like vultures. The rising sun emblem on his headband catches the morning light as he bows before his Zero fighter, modified with 550 pounds of explosives. "I'm going to fulfill the task which has been assigned to me," he tells his commander. "I shall not return." Yet some kamikaze pilots would return, a paradox that would haunt them for decades. May 11th, 1945. Okinawa waters. Lieutenant Takeo Washima's Zero sputters and coughs as he dives toward the USS Bunker Hill. Black smoke trails behind him, not from battle damage but mechanical failure. His engine seizes completely at 2,000 feet. The divine wind that should carry him to a glorious death abandons him. He pulls up, barely managing to limp back to Kyushu. That night, he writes in his journal, "I have failed the Emperor. I cannot face my comrades tomorrow." He would attempt suicide 3 more times, each time mechanical failures or weather conditions forcing his return. Scene Q. A trembling hand tears pages from a journal. Flames, consuming confessions never meant to be read. By August 1945, of the 3,860 kamikaze pilots who flew suicide missions, approximately 120 returned alive. The Japanese military created no protocol for these men. In the official records, they didn't exist. Their survival a shameful anomaly in the narrative of perfect sacrifice. Captain Masao Itagaki, commander of the Thunder Gods Corps at Kanoya Air Base, received these returned pilots with cold silence. "You are already dead men," he told Ensign Kenichiro Unuki after his third failed mission. "Your bodies simply haven't caught up with your spirits." Unuki was immediately reassigned to another suicide squadron, his previous failures unmentioned. The psychological burden proved unbearable. Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi, who returned after his fuel line ruptured mid-mission, hanged himself in the barracks that night. His suicide note read only, "I complete my mission now." Of the returned pilots, historical records indicate at least 27 took their own lives rather than face the shame of survival. Most telling was the testimony of Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who supervised kamikaze operations in the Philippines. In a 1972 interview, he revealed, "We never discussed the possibility of return. We never created protocols for it. In our minds, these men were already ceremonially dead. Their unexpected presence among the living disrupted the spiritual foundation of the entire program." For these men, breaking the silence about their experience proved impossible during the war. They existed in a liminal space, not honored as heroes, not recognized as survivors. The Imperial Japanese Navy's official documentation listed them as mission incomplete, their names removed from unit rosters, and their families never notified of their continued existence. The reversal of their expected destiny created a psychological paradox that would define the rest of their lives. They had prepared for death but were forced to live, ghosts walking among the living, their stories untold until decades after the war's end. May 11, 1945. Philippine Sea, 76 miles southwest of Okinawa. Lieutenant Takeo Kasuga's Mitsubishi A6M0 plummets through cloud cover, engine screaming, the American fleet growing larger in his windscreen. His heart pounds against his rib cage, not from fear, but from the solemn certainty of his destiny. His aircraft, loaded with a 550-pound bomb, carries enough explosive force to tear through an American destroyer. The young pilot had already performed the ritual of drinking sake, cutting a lock of hair, and writing a final letter home. He wears his white hachimaki headband emblazoned with the rising sun. Yet, in the moment his death should have been certain, fate intervenes. His engine sputters, black smoke billowing from the cowling. The Zero loses altitude rapidly, forcing Kasuga to ditch in the churning Pacific waters, becoming one of the estimated 1 in 10 kamikaze pilots who, against all expectations, survived their suicide missions. The Tokotai, Japan's special attack units, represented the Empire's desperate final strategy. By spring 1945, over 2,500 kamikaze pilots had perished in attacks against Allied vessels. These missions, conceived by Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi in October 1944, when the Americans landed at Leyte Gulf, were born of desperation as Japan faced critical shortages of trained pilots, fuel, and aircraft. In our present situation, Onishi had declared to the 201st Air Group, "I see no way to victory except to organize suicide attack units." For pilots like Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, who successfully struck USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, killing 393 American sailors, death was certain. But for others like Lieutenant Kasuga and Ensign Saburo Miyamoto, mechanical failures, Allied anti-aircraft fire, or weather conditions prevented them from completing their final mission. These men faced an unimaginable psychological burden. Having mentally and spiritually prepared for death, they were forced to return to a world they had already left behind. "We had already died before we took off," recalled Tadamasa Itatsu, a kamikaze pilot who survived when his mission was aborted due to American air superiority. "Our commanding officer gave us sake. I had already written my death poem. I was no longer among the living. The Imperial Japanese Navy's 5th Air Fleet records indicate that approximately 10% of kamikaze missions were aborted for various reasons. For every 9 pilots who perished in flames against American warships, 1 returned, carrying the unbearable weight of survival. Some faced accusations of cowardice. Others were immediately reassigned to new suicide missions. A few, like Lieutenant Kasuga, were captured by American forces after ditching at sea. Scene Q. A bedraggled Japanese pilot sits alone on the deck of an American destroyer, head bowed, as sailors watch him warily from a distance. The psychological toll was immense. Having performed their own funeral rites, said final goodbyes to loved ones, and mentally crossed the threshold between life and death. These men became ghosts, walking among comrades who could not understand their unique torment. But their unexpected survival would eventually provide the world with rare first-hand accounts of Japan's most desperate wartime strategy. What awaited these men who had failed in their sacred duty was perhaps more terrifying than death itself. April 1945. Kanoya Air Base, Kagoshima Prefecture. Lieutenant Takeo Tagata stands rigidly before his squadron commander, his flight suit still damp with sea spray, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly. The man who was supposed to be dead, who had taken the sacred sake in the farewell ceremony just hours earlier, now stands before his brothers in arms, alive. The silence in the room weighs heavier than any bomb his Oka rocket-powered suicide aircraft could have carried. "You have returned," states Commander Ryunosuke Kusaka, his voice devoid of inflection. The words hang in the air like the acrid smell of burning oil that permeates the base. Not a question, but an accusation. For the Tokotai pilots, the special attack corps that Westerners called Kamikaze, return was never part of the mission plan. Of the 3,060 Kamikaze pilots who flew suicide missions during the Pacific War, approximately 10% survived their missions. These men became living ghosts, caught between worlds, neither honored dead nor respected living. Tagata bows deeply. "The American destroyer's anti-aircraft fire damaged my aircraft's release mechanism. The mother plane could not deploy me." His voice sounds foreign even to himself. The technical explanation does nothing to alleviate the crushing weight of shame. According to historian Rikihei Inoguchi's post-war accounts, pilots who returned faced 3 distinct reactions: formal punishment, unofficial ostracism, or, most surprisingly, quiet reassignment. Imperial Japanese Navy records recovered after the war revealed that official policy regarding returned pilots was inconsistent and often determined by local command. For Ensign Kenichiro Unuki of the 721st Air Group, return meant immediate reassignment to another Toko mission. After mechanical failure forced his Betty bomber to abort its mission to Okinawa on May 11, 1945, his commander simply said, "The gods have given you another chance to die honorably." 3 days later, Unuki took off again. He never returned. Scene Q. A young pilot sits alone in the mess hall, other pilots visibly moving away from his table. The social death experienced by returned pilots was often worse than formal punishment. Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda described it in his secret diary, later recovered by American occupation forces. They do not speak to me. At dinner, the seat beside me remains empty. I have become a ghost before my death. Maeda would eventually volunteer for a ground assault unit on Okinawa, where he died in June 1945. Perhaps most telling was the case of Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, who survived 2 aborted kamikaze missions in April 1945 before successfully completing his suicide attack on USS Bunker Hill on May 11th, killing 393 American sailors and airmen. His squadron mates reported that between missions, Ogawa became increasingly withdrawn, writing in a final letter, "To fail in death is to fail the Emperor twice." Statistics compiled by U.S. Naval Intelligence in August 1945 estimated that approximately 391 kamikaze pilots returned from missions. Of these, 24% flew subsequent missions, 8% were formally disciplined, and most striking, 11% committed suicide upon return rather than face the shame. But what they faced next would test not only their courage, but their very understanding of honor in a military culture that had elevated death itself to the highest virtue. May 15th, 1945. Tokyo. Former kamikaze pilot Kazuo Sakamaki sits alone in a sparse American detention cell as Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles through radios across Japan, announcing surrender. Outside, his family has already conducted his funeral rites. His name adorns a spirit tablet at Yasukuni Shrine. But unlike 3,860 of his Tokotai brothers, Sakamaki still draws breath, a living ghost haunting the margins of a narrative that demanded his death. These men were never supposed to return. The Japanese military had systematically erased them from their records before they even took flight. Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi, a kamikaze pilot who survived when engine failure forced him to abort his final mission, wrote in his recovered diary, "Already I have been given a burial. I have ceased to exist in this world." This psychological death preceded the physical one that never came, for the estimated 1 in 50 kamikaze pilots who survived their missions through mechanical failure, Allied interception, or rare acts of personal choice, returning to Japan meant entering a twilight existence. Their government had already reported them as heroic martyrs. Their families had already mourned. The military pension system had no category for the walking dead. Takehiko Ina survived 3 separate kamikaze missions between March and June 1945, each time forced to return due to aircraft malfunctions or adverse weather. Upon his 3rd return to base on Kyushu, his squadron commander, Captain Morimasa Yunokawa, refused to make eye contact. "You are already dead to Japan," Yunokawa reportedly told him. "Your continued breathing is an administrative error." The psychological burden proved crushing. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo, who survived when his Zero fighter sustained critical damage during a kamikaze run against the USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, returned to discover that his belongings had been distributed among his squadron mates, and his letters home included the ritual lock of hair meant for funeral rites. "I became a ghost among my own people," Shindo later recounted to American historian Gordon Prang in 1978. "They had completed their grieving. My presence was uncomfortable." These survivors faced a unique form of survivor's guilt. Having been celebrated for their willingness to die, their continued existence became evidence of perceived failure. Military records show that of 47 documented kamikaze survivors interviewed after the war, 31 reported experiencing severe depression and social isolation upon return. The Japanese government's handling of these men reveals the paradoxical nature of the kamikaze program. Naval archives recovered in 1952 show that the Imperial Japanese Navy had no formal protocol for reintegrating pilots who returned. Their names remained on casualty lists. Their families received death benefits. In the bureaucratic machinery of wartime Japan, they existed in an administrative limbo, officially dead, inconveniently alive. Scene Q. A man stares at his own memorial tablet in a family shrine, fingers trembling as he traces the characters of his name carved in wood. The story of these living ghosts challenges our understanding of the kamikaze phenomenon. Their experiences reveal that behind the mythologized narrative of willful sacrifice lay a complex reality of coercion, expectation, and psychological manipulation. They had been transformed into symbols, and symbols weren't supposed to survive to tell their stories. August 15, 1945. Across Japan, Emperor Hirohito's crackling radio announcement echoes through barracks and naval bases. The war is over. For most soldiers, relief washes over them like a cleansing rain. But for the surviving kamikaze pilots, men who had psychologically died already, peace brings not liberation, but a crushing burden. They had failed at the one task they were never meant to survive. Takehiko Ina sits alone in his quarters at the Tsukuba Naval Air Base. His hands tremble as he stares at a photograph of his Tokatai squadron. 3 missions, 3 equipment failures, 3 returns to base when death should have claimed him. The tea beside him grows cold as tears silently track down his weathered face. He was supposed to be ash scattered across the Pacific. Instead, he breathes, while his brothers do not. The statistics haunt the survivors. Of approximately 4,000 kamikaze pilots who launched on suicide missions, only about 1 in 100 returned alive. These men, perhaps fewer than 40 across all of Japan, formed an unintentional brotherhood bound by shame rather than honor. Lieutenant Commander Iwatani Tsuneo, who had trained hundreds of Special Attack Corps pilots, recorded in his personal diary on September 3, 1945. The survivors walk among us like ghosts. They had crossed the threshold between worlds in their minds, only to be thrust back into this one by mechanical failure or mission abort. They are the living dead. For Saburo Sakai, a decorated fighter ace who had been reassigned to kamikaze operations in the war's final months, the psychological torment manifested physically. Military records from Yokosuka Naval Hospital show he developed severe insomnia and unexplained seizures. "When I sleep," he told his doctor in a session documented on November 18, 1945, "I see the faces of younger pilots who successfully completed their final missions. They ask why I still breathe when they fulfilled their duty to the Emperor." Reintegration into civilian society proved nearly impossible. Kazuo Nakajima, whose Zero fighter developed engine trouble over the Philippines in March 1945, forcing his return, found himself ostracized in his home village of Oita. Local police records document 3 incidents where he was assaulted by grieving families who had lost sons in kamikaze operations. "You were chosen to die with honor," one father reportedly shouted while striking him. "Yet you live while my son burns." Scene Q. Rain falling on a solitary figure kneeling before a makeshift shrine, surrounded by photographs of smiling young men in flight suits. The American occupation authorities recognized the unique psychological trauma of these men. In a classified report dated February 1946, Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Mashbeer of the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section noted, "The Kamikaze survivors represent a unique psychiatric challenge. Having psychologically prepared for death, they now face life without purpose. Suicide watch is strongly recommended." Indeed, records from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department show that between 1945 and 1950, at least 7 former kamikaze pilots died by suicide, unable to bear the weight of survival. Their final notes often expressed the same sentiment. They were completing the mission they had failed to accomplish during wartime. But what these men could never have anticipated was how long their burden would last. The weight of survival would not diminish with passing decades. It would transform, deepen, and follow them into old age like a shadow that could never be outrun. May 11th, 1945. The skies over the East China Sea. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakajima feels his Mitsubishi A6M0 shudder violently as the engine sputters, black smoke billowing from beneath the cowling. His mission, to crash his aircraft into the USS New Mexico, suddenly faces an unexpected obstacle: divine intervention, mechanical failure, or fate's cruel joke? For a kamikaze pilot, engine trouble wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an existential crisis. The engine died completely at 8,000 feet. Nakajima later recorded in his debriefing. "I tried 3 times to restart it. Each time I failed was another moment of shame. I had sworn to die for the Emperor." Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in suicide attacks against Allied vessels. But among the ranks of these Tokubetsu Kogekitai, special attack units, a little discussed phenomenon existed: those who returned. Imperial Japanese Navy records indicate that roughly 9% of all kamikaze pilots who took off on suicide missions returned to base. Nearly 350 men who had prepared for death but found themselves inexplicably alive. Commander Tadashi Minobe, head of the Mabalacat Airfield operations in the Philippines, documented these returns meticulously. His logbooks, recovered after the war, reveal the primary reasons: 40% mechanical failure, 23% inability to locate targets, 19% adverse weather conditions, 12% Allied fighter interception forcing retreat, and 6% listed simply as pilot decision. For Lieutenant Kasuga Takeo, who returned 3 times from failed missions, the psychological burden became unbearable. "Each night I would write a new death poem," he recalled in a 1973 interview. "Each morning I would wake, still alive, to face my comrades. Their eyes held questions no man should have to answer." The Imperial Japanese Navy's Thunder Gods Corps maintained strict protocols for these returns. Captain Rikahei Inoguchi, who supervised kamikaze operations from Mabalacat, established the 3 return rule. A pilot could attempt 3 missions before facing court-martial. His handwritten directive, preserved in Tokyo's Yushukan War Memorial Museum, states, "The pilot who returns citing mechanical failure must present evidence of such failure or face immediate disciplinary action." Lieutenant Takashi Nagase documented in his diary how mechanics would sometimes sabotage aircraft, deliberately introducing minor faults that would force pilots to return. Crew Chief Yamamoto confessed to me he loosened the fuel line on Ensign Kato Zero, Nagase wrote. He said, "The boy is only 17. I cannot bear to lose another child. The statistical reality of these returns contradicted the propaganda. While Japanese civilians were told that kamikaze pilots achieved a 100% success rate, U.S. Navy damage assessments show only 14% of kamikaze attacks successfully struck their targets. Among those who returned, 65% would eventually fly again and perish on subsequent missions. Scene Q: a lone Zero fighter limping back to base, smoke trailing, as ground crew watch with mixed emotions: relief, disappointment, confusion, their faces revealing the complex moral calculus of a military culture caught between duty and humanity. June 1945. Tokyo, Japan. Lieutenant Takeo Tagata sits alone in a sparse military dormitory, staring at the wall. His hands, once steady at the controls of his Mitsubishi A6M0, now tremble uncontrollably. 3 weeks earlier, engine failure forced him to abort his Toko mission just 80 kilometers from the American fleet. The man who was supposed to die as a hero of the Emperor now lives as something worse than a prisoner, a kamikaze who survived. They would not look me in the eye. Tagata later wrote in his private journal, "My squadron mates, who had not yet flown their final missions, treated me as if I were already a ghost, but the wrong kind. Not the revered spirit of a fallen warrior, but an embarrassment to be avoided." By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had sent approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots to their deaths. For the estimated 1 in 10 who returned due to mechanical failures, weather conditions, or inability to locate targets, survival meant entering a psychological purgatory. These men had already completed their mental preparation for death, participated in ceremonial last meals, and given away their possessions. Their families had often already received notice of their heroic sacrifices. Masazumi Inada, a Zero pilot who returned after 3 failed kamikaze attempts, described the homecoming. "When I landed, the maintenance crew looked at me with contempt. The commander said nothing, but his silence was worse than any punishment. I had been given sacred sake from the emperor. I had written my death poem. My mother had already received my farewell letter and lock of hair. How could I explain why I still breathed? The psychological trauma was often unbearable." Records from Naval Base Kanoya show that between October 1944 and August 1945, at least 15 returned kamikaze pilots committed suicide by traditional means rather than face the shame of their continued existence. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, who helped organize kamikaze operations, noted in his post-war account that some pilots who returned were immediately reassigned to new missions, a form of psychological relief that resolved their ambiguous status. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, who later successfully completed a kamikaze mission against USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, had previously returned from a failed mission. His commander, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, recorded in his diary, "Ogawa begged for another chance with such determination that I could not refuse him. His face showed the torment of a man caught between worlds." Scene Q. A returned pilot sits in Caesar position before his commander, head bowed so low it nearly touches the floor, begging for reassignment. The burden extended beyond the pilots themselves. Corporal Shigeyoshi Hamazono, a ground crew member at Kanoya Air Base, recalled, "We were trained not to form attachments to the special attack pilots, but when Yoshino returned after his engine failed, we didn't know how to treat him. He had already died in our minds. Some believed it was bad luck to even speak to him. For those who survived until Japan's surrender, a different kind of torment awaited. They would live decades carrying both the psychological preparation for a sacrificial death and the knowledge that they had failed in their final duty. As Japan rebuilt, these men became living ghosts, reminders of a national trauma many preferred to forget, but the war's end would bring even more complex reckonings for these survivors who never completed their final mission. July 1946. Tokyo, Japan. Former Kamikaze pilot Kazuo Nakajima stands before the ruins of his family home, a place he never expected to see again. His hands, once steady on the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M0, tremble slightly as he sifts through the charred remains. The man who had written his final letters, drunk his ceremonial sake, and flown toward American warships with 550 pounds of explosives strapped to his aircraft, now faces a future he was never supposed to have. Of the 4,000 kamikaze pilots who died during the war, he is among the mere 1% who survived their suicide missions, men caught in the liminal space between heroic death and dishonorable survival. We who returned were left to live with a terrible weight, Nakajima later wrote in his 1981 memoir, Between Two Skies. Not the weight of shame, as many believed, but the weight of purpose. What does one do with a life that was already offered up? The survivors of the special attack units, Tokubetsu Kogekitai, faced unique psychological challenges. Lieutenant Takehiko Ina, who survived 3 separate kamikaze missions due to engine failures and bad weather, returned to a Japan that didn't know what to make of him. Imperial military doctrine had offered no contingency for survivors. These men had completed the ritual preparations for death, written jisei, death poems, distributed personal belongings, and received the hachimaki headband. Their spiritual departure was complete. Their physical survival was almost an administrative error. According to military historian Dr. M.G. Sheftall, author of Blossoms in the Wind, Human Legacies of the Kamikaze, approximately 39 confirmed kamikaze pilots survived the war. Their reasons for survival varied: mechanical failures, aborted missions due to poor visibility, being shot down but surviving, or in rare cases, deliberately turning back. Former Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had helped create the kamikaze program, could not face these survivors. On August 16, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender, he committed ritual suicide, leaving a note apologizing to the pilots who had died under his command. His death offered no closure to those who lived. In post-war Japan, these survivors rebuilt lives in remarkable ways. Shigeyoshi Hamazono, whose Zero fighter crashed after a mechanical failure during his kamikaze mission, became a commercial airline pilot, transforming his relationship with flight from an instrument of death to one of connection. Each safe landing became a form of redemption, he told the Asahi Shimbun newspaper in 1972, Kaname Harada, who survived when his mission was aborted, established a kindergarten in Nagano Prefecture, dedicating his unexpected years to nurturing the next generation. I was prepared to die for my country, Harada said in a 2015 interview, at age 98. Instead, I found myself living for it in a way I never imagined. Scene Q. Elderly hands gently guiding a child's fingers as they fold an origami crane, symbol of peace, rising from the hands that once gripped warplane controls. These men carried forward not just memories, but questions that would haunt an entire nation's understanding of sacrifice, duty, and survival. Their unexpected journeys would become some of the most profound, if overlooked, legacies of Japan's desperate final war strategy, living testaments to what happens when death becomes duty, and then, against all odds, life continues anyway. Tokyo, 2005. Former Imperial Japanese Navy pilot Kazuo Nakajima, 83, sits rigidly in his chair, hands trembling slightly as cameras focus on his weathered face. For 60 years, he has carried a burden few could comprehend, the stigma of survival. "We were not supposed to return," he says quietly. "Those who did were ghosts walking among the living." The room falls silent. These are the words of a man who was ordered to die but lived to tell his story. Nakajima is one of the estimated 6,000 pilots trained for Japan's special attack units, the infamous Kamikaze Corps, but among the mere dozens who survived to old age after being assigned to suicide missions. In the early 2000s, as the last of these elderly survivors approached their final years, a remarkable shift occurred. Men who had maintained decades of silence began to speak. The Asukuni Shrine archives in Tokyo recorded testimonies from 14 confirmed kamikaze survivors between 2003 and 2008. Their stories reveal the complex reality behind Japan's most desperate wartime tactic. Takahiko Ina, another survivor who flew 3 missions but returned each time due to mechanical failures, described the psychological toll. "At age 23, I was prepared to die. When I returned, I felt shame so profound I could not face my comrades' families." According to military records examined by historian M.G. Sheftall, returning pilots were often reassigned immediately, sometimes flying, up to 5 missions before either perishing or seeing the war's end. The survivors' testimonies challenge simplified Western narratives. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo, who commanded the 301st Air Group at Kanoya Air Base, explained, "We were not brainwashed fanatics. We were soldiers following orders in a nation facing annihilation." Military records confirm his statement. By late 1944, Japan's conventional air defense had been decimated, with over 8,000 aircraft lost in the Philippines campaign alone. The most revealing testimonies come from pilots like Kenichiro Unuki, who survived when his Zero fighter developed engine trouble over the Philippine Sea on January 5, 1945. "As I turned back toward base, I saw my 2 wingmen continue toward the American fleet. I watched them dive into a destroyer. That night, their empty bunks testified to my failure." Official Navy records confirm the attack Unuki describes. The USS Omani Bay was struck by kamikazes that day, killing 95 American sailors. Perhaps most poignant are the accounts of how these men lived with survival. Tadamasa Itatsu, whose mission was canceled when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, spoke of the second life phenomenon. "We had already said goodbye to this world. Our parents had held funerals for us. When peace came, we had to learn how to live again in a world that had moved on without us." As historian Rikihei Inoguchi documented in The Divine Wind, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died during the war. For the few who survived, their testimonies provide a rare glimpse into one of history's most extreme military tactics, not through technical analysis, but through the human experience of men who carried the weight of intended martyrdom through lives never meant to be lived. March 19, 1945. Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Takehiko Ena's Suisei dive bomber sputters and coughs as he approaches the American fleet. His hands grip the controls with white-knuckled intensity. The sacred white headband, the hachimaki, bears the rising sun and the kanji characters for certain victory. But today, certain death will be denied by mechanical failure. His engine seizes, black smoke billowing from the cowling. The American's anti-aircraft fire tears through his right wing. But it's his own aircraft's betrayal that will save his life. The engine stopped completely. Ino would later recount in his rare 1997 testimony to the Yasukuni Shrine Historical Museum. I had no choice but to turn back. I felt shame beyond words. Mechanical failures represented the most common reason kamikaze pilots returned from their final missions. Approximately 71% of all aborted Toko missions, according to Imperial Japanese Navy records recovered after the war. For the pilots trained to die, these failures created a psychological paradox: salvation through disgrace. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakajima experienced this contradiction on April 6, 1945, during Operation Kikusui, the massive kamikaze assault on Allied vessels near Okinawa. His Zero fighter, loaded with a 550-pound bomb, developed catastrophic oil pressure problems just 45 minutes into his final flight. Black fluid sprayed across his cockpit windscreen, obscuring his vision. The aircraft became uncontrollable. I could not see. I could not fly. Nakajima recorded in his private journal, now preserved at Tokyo's Yushukan Museum. The ancestors denied me my glorious death. I returned in shame, but secretly in my heart, may Buddha forgive me, I felt relief. This duality of emotions haunted many returned Tako pilots. They had been celebrated with sake parties the night before. Their commanding officers had symbolically struck their names from the unit roster. They had written final letters home. The psychological preparation for death was complete. Yet they lived. Ensign Mitsuo Kano's experience reveals another dimension of the mechanical reprieve. On May 11, 1945, his aircraft's release mechanism jammed during his attack run on the USS New Mexico. Despite multiple attempts, the 800-kilogram bomb remained stubbornly attached to his aircraft's belly. Without the weight reduction, his plane lacked the necessary speed to ensure destruction of the target vessel. I circled 3 times, Kano stated during a rare 1972 interview with American historian Gordon Prange. Each time I tried to release the bomb. Each time it failed. My commander had been explicit. If the primary weapon system failed, we were to return. The Emperor needed planes more than corpses. This practical calculus, the conservation of increasingly scarce aircraft, led to the surprising standing order that pilots should abort their suicide missions if mechanical issues prevented effective attacks. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, issued this directive in February 1945 as Japan's aircraft production capabilities crumbled under American bombing. By war's end, approximately 1,036 kamikaze pilots had died in suicide attacks, while an estimated 279 pilots returned from failed missions, according to research by historian M.G. Sheftall. For these men, equipment failures delivered them to an impossible future, one they were never supposed to see. October 1945. The war has ended, but for the surviving kamikaze pilots, a different battle begins. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakajima sits alone in his family home in Yokohama, curtains drawn despite the pleasant autumn weather. His neighbors walk past without acknowledgement. The postman no longer meets his eyes when delivering mail. The man who had once been celebrated as a hero of the Special Attack Corps now exists as a ghost among the living. We who returned were left to die a slow death in silence, Nakajima would write in his private journal in 1952, one of the few records that survived from this period of enforced silence. The dead were honored. We, the living, were condemned to carry shame. The approximately 400 kamikaze pilots who survived the war, whether through mechanical failures, aborted missions, or the war's sudden end, faced a devastating psychological paradox. They had been prepared to die, celebrated for their willingness to sacrifice, then denied their destiny. In a culture where the successful completion of one's assigned duty was paramount, they had failed in the most public way possible. Captain Toshiharu Koneda, former instructor at the Tsuchiura Naval Air Base, observed the phenomenon firsthand. These young men returned to a society that didn't know what to do with them. He noted in a 1970 interview with historian Rikihei Inoguchi. They had been given farewell parties. Their families had often held funeral ceremonies in anticipation. Their return was uncomfortable. The stigma manifested in concrete ways. Government records from 1946-1950 show that former kamikaze pilots were frequently denied employment opportunities. A survey conducted by the American Occupation Authorities in 1947 found that 62% of returned kamikaze pilots reported experiencing direct discrimination. Many were excluded from veterans associations and community events. Most devastating was the silence. The Japanese government, under American occupation, actively discouraged discussion of the kamikaze program. Official documents were destroyed. Veterans were instructed not to speak of their experiences. The psychological toll was immense. Former pilot Takahiko Shibata described it in his memoir, Between Two Skies, 1975. We were not permitted to mourn our dead comrades publicly. We were not allowed to explain our experiences. We existed in a vacuum of history, neither heroes nor criminals, but something unnamed and unacknowledged. The silence extended to families as well. Yuriko Nakamura, sister of returned kamikaze pilot Shigeru Nakamura, recalled in a 2005 documentary. My brother never spoke of what happened, not once in 60 years. When the topic of the war arose, he would leave the room. His wife confided that he suffered nightmares until his death in 1998. Statistics compiled by psychologist Dr. Hideo Takahashi in 1985 revealed the lasting trauma. Among 211 surviving kamikaze pilots studied, 87% reported persistent symptoms of what would now be classified as PTSD. The suicide rate among survivors was 3.4 times higher than the national average between 1950 and 1970. Scene Q. An elderly man sits alone on a park bench, watching cherry blossoms fall. His weathered hands tremble slightly as he opens an old photograph of young pilots standing before their aircraft. No one notices as a single tear falls onto the faded image. In the quiet suburbs of Tokyo, 1975. Saburo Sakai, former Imperial Japanese Navy pilot who had flown alongside kamikaze units but survived the war, stands before a gathering of aging men. These are not ordinary veterans. They are the Tokotai pilots who, by mechanical failure, weather, or command recall, returned from missions meant to end in their deaths. 30 years after the war's end, their weathered faces still carry the weight of a peculiar survivor's guilt, men who lived when their sacred duty was to die. The legacy of Japan's estimated 3,800 kamikaze pilots has always been viewed through the lens of those who perished. Yet approximately 10% of all Tokotai pilots survived the war. Men sent on missions but recalled, men whose planes malfunctioned, men who simply could not complete their final objective. Their post-war existence became a historical footnote, their struggles largely invisible to a society that preferred to memorialize the dead rather than confront the living. "We who returned carried a burden heavier than death," recounted Takehiko Ina in his 1995 memoir. One of the rare kamikaze pilots who spoke openly about his experience, Ina had been sent on 3 separate suicide missions, each aborted due to mechanical failures or poor weather. In the eyes of some, we had failed Japan. In our own eyes, we had failed our brothers. The statistical reality is stark. Of the approximately 380 Tokotai pilots who survived their missions, nearly 40% reported experiencing severe depression in post-war studies conducted by psychiatrist Dr. Shigeru Nakayama between 1952 and 1967. His groundbreaking work, The Psychological Aftermath of Survival Among Toko Pilots, documented rates of alcoholism at 27% among survivors, nearly triple the national average at that time. Scene Q. Elderly hands tremble while placing incense at a memorial, faces reflecting decades of unresolved trauma. Reintegration into civilian society proved exceptionally difficult. Captain Morimasa Yunakawa, who had trained kamikaze pilots at Chiran Air Base and survived when Japan surrendered before his own planned suicide mission, established the Toko Survivors Association in 1957. The organization operated in near secrecy for its first decade, with many members fearing public recognition. "We live between worlds," Yunakawa told the Asahi Shimbun in a rare 1970 interview. "We were prepared for death, not for the long silence that followed life." The psychological transformation these men underwent mirrors what modern psychiatry recognizes as identity fracture. Their entire purpose had been to die gloriously for emperor and nation, leaving them existentially adrift in defeat and peace. Dr. Nakayama's studies found that 63% of survivors reported feeling they had no clear purpose, even decades after the war ended. Yet from this trauma emerged profound wisdom. Many survivors became Japan's most eloquent anti-war voices. Kazuo Nakamura, who survived when his Zero developed engine trouble during a March 1945 Okinawa mission, spent 50 years speaking to schoolchildren about the futility of glorifying death. Before his passing in 2011, he had addressed over 100,000 Japanese students. "I was taught to die," his standard presentation began, "but I had to learn how to live." In their survival, these men ultimately offered Japan something perhaps more valuable than their sacrifices would have: living testimony to the human cost of militarism and the complex journey of reclaiming one's humanity from the machinery of war.